So we're now going to hear from Marian Rutigliano. She's from the USA, came of age and grew up in the early days of the second wave radical feminist. Every single radical feminist I've ever heard of, Marian has met and had a cup of tea with. And so every time I say, oh, did you meet so-and-so? She goes, oh, yeah, and has a story. So it's really fantastic because she's been around a long time, knows lots and lots of interesting stories, and is going to tell us about experiences as a young lesbian in New York City in the 70s and beyond, and anything else. So over to you, Marian.
Hi. So this is going to be perhaps a little shorter, perhaps more than a stroll down memory lane, but not quite an intense radical feminist analysis. I came out in 1969. That was a big year. I mean, that was a very big year. A couple of big things happened in 1969, and I just kind of, I came out by, I was allowed to, I grew up in New York City, and I was allowed to go down into the city, the village, when I was 13, 13, and just happened to walk completely unwittingly into a meeting room full of daughters of Bilitis. We're just like hanging out there, and saw one come in and kiss her girlfriend and thought, oh, that's what I am. And that's how I came out. That was it. And it was, it was an incredible summer, obviously, Stonewall, Woodstock. I was just this kid. So all these women who created the second wave, who were writing all those books, either lived in the city permanently for a while, or they came through, they were guest lecturers, and they were very accessible, especially for just like some young woman, me, who just didn't know you weren't supposed to go up to them. So I would talk to them. Kate Millett's giving a talk. I just hung around afterwards and would ask her about, the first feminist book I ever read was Sexual Politics, long before I had sex. So just asked her about it. All these women were around, and they were accessible. I don't know at the time that I was aware of kind of infighting or disagreements or things like that. I just absorbed it all, and I read all the books. And I found out as I got older, the drinking age at the time was 18. And it was hard to sneak into the bars any earlier than that, because it was already, difficult having a lesbian bar. A lot of them were run by organized crime, which actually, there was a really weird relationship between lesbian bars and organized crime, because these organized crime dudes would kind of keep things safe and pay off the cops and be there for muscle, some guy named Knuckles, as protection if the police came around, or if guys came around waiting outside afterwards when women came out. So I didn't get to go to the bars till I was older. There was some stuff for there were tea dances and things like that. But it was clear when I finally did get to the bars that men were trying to sneak their way in. Even then, the men we today call trans males or trans women, they were there, they were around. People were just they weren't around. Yeah, there were transsexuals. So there were the old school transsexuals, mostly gay men, but the forerunners, the protoplasm of the supposed trans women that we see today were around. They would sometimes try to come into the bars after work, 6, 7 o'clock, in a business suit and say, oh, I didn't know this was just a women's bar. Can't I just have a drink? I'm on my way home from work. And mostly they would get booted out, because at the time you could still do that, and lesbian bartenders would boot them out, or they would come in at night when women were, when it was busy and it was dancing and drinking, and they'd come in and drag and try to get in. And again, most of the time they would be booted out, because at the time you could do that and they had no recourse. The thing that mostly kept them away and away from us and in the closet was that, it was shame. It was really, embarrassing for them to be seen like that. They could lose their jobs, they could lose their families. The kind of civil rights stuff that, that shouldn't happen. But that's part of what kept them out. There would be social events where there might be, sometimes they'd be fundraisers, sometimes they'd just be dances, gay dances, and it might be mixed gay men and lesbians. And they would, these guys would be there trying to hit on the lesbians, and they would try to glom onto, the most feminine or, cute androgynous lesbian they could find. So this is the kind of stuff that was going on. This is what they, they were there. They were there, and there were, somebody's looking at the chat, and somebody's talking about Scum Manifesto. I love that book. But there were a couple of very savvy lesbian bartenders and gay male drag queens who weren't quite so misogynist, who saw these guys, these forerunners of the men who have now completely decimated lesbian spaces. They saw them, and I remember hearing and being told, these guys, if they ever, if they're gonna ruin you. I mean, they're gonna sneak in. They're gonna ruin you. There is something really, really wrong with these guys. And when we'd be at these, co-ed dances and stuff, and the gay male drag queens really hated the what we now call trans women. They hated them, and the trans women wanted no part of, supposed trans women, transvestites really wanted no part of the gay male drag queens because they weren't gay. I mean, they weren't gay then. We didn't have the word autogynephilia, but in retrospect, it was applicable. And like I said, they could still be kicked out of women's spaces. They didn't try to violate consciousness raising groups. They didn't try and violate other discussion groups at the time, besides bars. And this is, keep in mind, this is Manhattan. This is New York City, the West Village. This is like ground zero for lesbiana in the United States, maybe along with San Francisco. But this was really a unique kind of almost a living social experiment of something that just had never been seen before. So there were bookstores, there were lesbian bookstores, like a lot of them, and they'd have meetings and discussion groups. And the transvestites, these guys, wouldn't try to violate CR groups, conscious raising. They wouldn't go to the bookstore discussion groups. They weren't doing any of that. They just wanted to get into lesbian spaces. And if they'd be in a bar, they'd be like staring at us. You'd try to dance, and they'd be just like staring at it. It was pretty disgusting. There were mitigating factors. There were things that made it better for us. Number one, this was, what I sometimes call the age of androgyny. Butch femme had really been a thing for a long time partly because it was safe. A woman couldn't be seen wearing, certain, you had to wear so many, I think it's 3 articles of women's clothing or something. So they really had a pass as men to be in public at all. And it was, butch femme was a thing, but by the 70s, everything was fairly androgynous. I'm not sure what that label really means or meant, because there still was, some variation in how women dressed and behaved, obviously for individuals, but there was no, the edges, the extremes of butch and femme were no longer there, and men hated it. They hated that. They absolutely hated it. And the transvestites, who we now call trans women, particularly hated it because they had been, just so awful to the butch women, really just heavy-handed, just saying awful stuff. And now they push them into, mutilating, bodies and souls. But they were terrible to the butch women and tried to, and they were really creepy and rapey like they are today to the femme women. But when we were all androgynous, the transvestites, they hated it. They absolutely hated it. They didn't know who to glom onto. There was who were they going to insult? Who were they going to, they didn't know. So they really, really hated it. And the other mitigating factor was private clubs. If someone had a business and had a large room in the back, or could even shut the windows in the front of the business, they would have a club with a lookout, and you would have to be a club member. It was very, you had to be vouched for, and if they didn't like you at the door, they wouldn't let you in. You had to know somebody, so you had to. It was you could do this privately at the time. Or in if somebody had a large house and such. Economically, a lot of us don't have this anymore. People are in tiny apartments with lots of roommates sometimes. I don't know that anybody really has lots of businesses anymore with big open spaces, but that would be something if people wanted to help, is to find the legislative and legal foundations for keeping or supporting private freedom of association. You know, can we do this? I mean, what can we do anymore? Legally, what can we do to exclude? And exclusion meaning healthy boundaries. And if someone has like private spaces for meeting, whether it's a private, America is in particular basically worships private property. So if there's a private space, you generally are allowed to just tell people, no, you can't come here, it's trespassing, as long as you don't advertise it publicly. So that's what I remember growing up with. And you know, you'd meet all these fantastic women. I didn't know that this, I thought she was old at the time, but I didn't know that this old Black woman that I went up to and started asking about racism one day was Audre Lorde. I mean, I didn't know. So that they were all there, and they would, you know, they would speak freely to you. The word radical means root, and it's a mathematical term. You know, when you do a square root, the thing under the square root sign is the radical, and it means getting to the root of things. So.
Yeah, now I've just found actually this what we had in the introduction. It's saying we'd like to help women understand radical feminist analysis based on the work of the women who created it. So yes, your point about radical meaning root. Will you explain that?
Someone explained it to me, a woman whose name I forget, but she said, if you want to, that it was almost like back engineering, that if you wanted to know how something works, it's like, this happens. Okay, well, why does this happen? What things came before a woman choosing prostitution? What things came before a man, you know, choosing pornography and the woman choosing to be in pornography? Was it really a choice? What happened before the prostitution, before the pornography? What happened before the woman got married? What happened before? And everything that you could say is, well, before this happened, a woman was in poverty, or a man was taught this. And if you kept going, what happened before that? What happened before that? You go back to when you're born, and you're born either male or female. And the root of it all is the first thing that happens in any of our lives. We are either born male or female. And if you're born male or female, that means that you get placed into one class of people or another class of people simply based on the fact that you were born either male or female. And then everything that comes after that, everything, you know, starting from the time you're born, is because you are in one of those classes or another. And knowing that women are in the oppressed class and men are in the oppressor class doesn't start when we're all 21 years old. It doesn't start when we're 18. It starts when we are born.
So Marian, I mean, I also think you might have said this, but I didn't hear. But that a nice thing, or a thing I like about the word radical, is that it is asking for change. It's a bit more extreme than just saying we just need to change things a tiny weeny bit. Radical has always seemed to me to be saying we want a lot of change. But radis, I think a lot of women here will know that it's comes from root, which so that's what Marian's saying is radical means the root of things. Would you say you're a radical feminist, Marian?
Yeah, I mean, radical doesn't mean extreme, like you said. And somebody said,
okay, right.
Yeah, that's what you just said. It doesn't mean extreme.
Yeah, maybe it doesn't. Yeah, fair enough.
And somebody says T. Grace claims to have invented the term radical feminism. She may have. She's the first person I ever heard use that term. But it was around, so I don't know. I used to follow her around like a puppy. She would talk someplace, and she was brilliant. So she was one of the first women that I ever heard say that. And in the chat, someone is also talking about T. Grace naming men as the agents of our oppression. Yeah, I mean, Mary Daly talks around that also, is the courage to name. That patriarchy is the land and the domain of men. But yeah, I'd call myself a radical feminist because I walked into a room of lesbians and started reading books, and that's how I understand things. I mean, everything that I come up with as an opinion is because I start at the beginning and follow it through and see how we got to where we are. It's not like I don't like that you're doing that. And when so-called liberal feminism came around, it just seemed like an odd thing to do, to say that you had a choice about something with no reference to the conditions under which you made those choices. If I am, if I'm in a, and I always use the analogy of a POW camp, but if I'm in a prisoner of war camp, or if I'm enslaved, every choice I make is in the context of being in a prisoner of war camp or being, enslaved.
Yeah, absolutely. What that's so good, and it's very clear. You mentioned Valerie Solanis's book, The Scum Manifesto. Did you ever meet her?
No, I never did. I never met.
Did she hang out in the lesbian bars, or like?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, as soon as I got old enough to be, of course, yeah. I mean, let me qualify that as I met my partner when I was 18. So I didn't go in there to date. We went in there to dance and socialize and, and drink. So, but oh yeah, of course. I mean, yeah. I mean, and I feel so bad for young lesbians now, because we tell them and how many lesbian bars there were. Now, again, this is in context, New York City, Manhattan at the height of the 70s, in the West Village. But, even by 10 years later, you could go to the counties in New Jersey and Long Island and north of New York, Nassau County, Long Island. If you were there in the early 80s, or through the mid 80s, there were 4, 5, or 6 lesbian bars within 15, 20 minutes driving of wherever you lived. And that was extraordinary. I mean, that was really extraordinary.
I mean, one of the things, I went to New York, I think in the late 80s, and it went to and the 90s, and went to lesbian bars, and it was great. And then I also went to California, to San Francisco, and me and my friends, we went to see some women who were all living in the hills in Berkeley or somewhere like that. And it basically looked like the whole of the lesbian community were all living in really nice little leafy suburbs in the hills around San Francisco. And they were all trying to have babies, and they were not very political. And I think, I mean, that's a problem recently, isn't it? That loads of women, as society's got less aggressive towards lesbians, loads of lesbians have moved to the leafy suburbs, and they're not concentrated in those city centers.
We thought what we had, we took it for granted, and we thought it would be there forever. And we left to go pursue careers, and domestic life, free of walking out and just being beat up because we were lesbians, and we abandoned it. And I feel really bad for young lesbians that we did abandon it, and had babies and it's having babies and having careers. I mean, that's all fine, but we did not keep up the community that we somehow thought would always be there.